Hello all, Infernal here. I've finally played the Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and my initial truncated response is, it's amazing, incredible. Any and all positive adjectives would apply here. This is the first time I've played a FromSoft DLC on release, even though I've played through all the other Soulsborne games, and I was excited to experience this while the proverbial shrink wrap was still being removed, so to speak. Before I dive in, keep in mind that this video will have spoilers, so I suggest at least skipping the story section down below if you want to experience it completely new. Otherwise, let's get right into the review. The first impressions the DLC left on me were unforgettable, and as I said, I went into the DLC dark, avoiding as much footage as possible and allowing myself the joy of discovery. It's a choice I really appreciated, as I was able to be fully wowed by the presentation in real time. Every new area I came across was a feast, and letting myself soak in the atmosphere instead of simply running from gray site to gray site allowed me an appreciation of not just the DLC, but of the base game of Elden Ring as well. In fact, as previous FromSoft DLC has done, it elevated my opinion of the full game as a whole, especially when viewed as a collection of experiences. FromSoft excels at creating DLC. I'd argue that it's at the point of any given game when they've fully figured out the mechanics, bosses, and level design, and as such the DLC ends up being a highlight of the game itself. The Bloodborne Old Hunters DLC, for example, has the best bosses in the entire game, and also the best level layout. From is also great at making their DLC fit nicely within the lore and story of each game. The Artorias of the Abyss DLC for Dark Souls featured a character who was frequently referenced in the base game, and the Dark Souls 3 Ring City DLC tied all three games of the trilogy together to a climactic and apocalyptic end. Again, it's par the course with Shadows of the Erdtree. As we get into the story, this section will undoubtedly be the most spoiler-heavy of this video, so be warned. The story of Shadows of the Erdtree continues From's tradition of featuring tragic figures and events that seldom end well for the featured world. Miquella is featured prominently in the lore, and is presented as a tragic figure with a desire to save their family and the world itself, only to become disillusioned with the process, sacrificing too much and becoming a part of the cycle, wanting the world to burn just as Marika did. We learn more about Marika's tragedy, her people getting slaughtered, and put into jars by the horn scent. It's implied that she was manipulated by the fingers during a particularly vulnerable and emotional event in her life, which in turn sparked her genocidal war on the world. As a Souls vet, I noticed parallels to Maiden Astria in Demon Souls, and even Gwyn in Dark Souls, two figures who arguably had good intentions, but ended up causing a torrent of harm in their wake. Some of the side events and areas were a real treat, especially as a way of fleshing out the main story, the main game. Especially learning about Midra's ambition to be Lord of Frenzied Flame, and also of a long-standing conflict between Baal the Dread and Placidusax. I really enjoyed that Elden Ring made an effort to have many dragons, that are typically few and far between in other Souls games, and gave them an interesting backstory to boot. And finally, Radahn's back. I'm not sure where I'd currently rank Radahn 2.0 as a boss within the game of Elden Ring, or even in terms of the other Souls games for that matter, but I did enjoy the concept of Radahn being resurrected from an echo to fulfill a childhood wish. The contrast of Miquella being given the title The Kind through the game, only to reveal their true sociopathic intentions, is extremely interesting, and I'm always a fan of stories that present villainous characters that begin as well-intentioned. So, here are some nitpicks or cracks in the veneer, as it were. To be clear, I think the game is incredible, as I've said before, so this isn't my attempt to break down every flaw, but I do think there were some things I was slightly irked by. My main issue, if there is one, is one that I also think the main game suffers from, which is that there are several large areas with almost nothing around. Maybe this is my issue with open world games in general, but I get frustrated seeing expanses that look fully explorable, only to not find anything worth the effort. Yes, the strong art direction ensures that the player is at least looking at interesting scenery, but I like being surprised and rewarded for my efforts to find areas off the beaten path, and there were far too many empty places for my personal liking. This is something that I always appreciated about the older Souls games, that I feel is just a little bit missing in Elden Ring. So the second thing for me is the bosses. Now, I want to preface this and be absolutely clear that I don't think the quality of the bosses is bad at all. In fact, it's excellent across the board. However, my feeling was that they didn't reach the same highs of some bosses that I've experienced in previous Souls games. And again, this is my personal opinion. I mentioned that the DLC absolutely elevates the main game, and that remains true with the overall quality of the bosses, but I didn't find any boss that beat Gale, Lady Maria, Fried, or Ishin for me. The presentation is incredibly strong throughout, but I just couldn't meet the same highs that I got from the bosses mentioned. In this section, I also want to address the difficulty woes that I've heard since the DLC released. I'm genuinely not trying to gatekeep here, but I think some of the complaints are from people who haven't experienced FromSoft DLC before. That's fine, of course, but FromSoft DLC is absolutely intended for extremely late game, namely endgame characters, and the difficulty spikes are notable. Dark Souls 3 was my first Souls game, and there was a very pronounced difference with even the basic mob enemies when I stepped into the Ring City DLC. So is the Elden Ring DLC hard? Sure, but it's also expected that it would be, and as such, I personally enjoyed the challenge. All in all, Shadows of the Erdtree is an absolute triumph. This is a DLC that has more content, care, and detail than some other full-length games. It has bettered my opinion of Elden Ring as a whole, and cemented it as one of the most important games released in at least the last 10 years. It continues FromSoft's recent tradition of releasing games in the top tier of the market. Does it dethrone the old Hunters DLC from Bloodborne for me? No, I don't think so, although perhaps given time it has the potential to. And time it shall have, because there's more than enough content to keep one occupied for hundreds of hours easily. Get it. It's that simple. And I'll see you in the Shadowlands. Thanks for watching. I'd love to do more videos in this sort of review format, in addition to the tier list videos I've been doing on this channel. I have plans for many more videos to come, including my ranking of Soulsborne games, and someday maybe my top 10 favorite games of all time. I appreciate all the support, so a like or subscribe goes a long way. Thanks again, and happy gaming.